Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, thank you so very much for listening. We so appreciate it. We also appreciate the support for the show that some of you listeners, who, again, we really appreciate, have decided to bestow upon us by going to jeffersonhour.com and clicking on donate. Perhaps you've made a one-time donation. Perhaps you've decided to join the 1776 Club. Perhaps you've decided to leave your ranch to Mr. Jenkinson.
Finally, somebody else who's arguing for my ranch.
This week we had a great conversation, as usual, when we have conversations with Professor Joseph Ellis. And we talked about his new book, which just came out, The Cause. And it was interesting. One of the things that comes up in the conversation is Joe said, looking at his list of books, it's either 13 or 14. We don't know who's counting. But he said that he probably should have written this one first, sort of as a bedrock for the rest of his work, but then later admitted that had he not written all those other books, he probably couldn't have written this one in the way that he did. It was a great conversation. You had some particularly insightful questions for him, Clay.
Well, thank you. I've read most of the book. It's a really extraordinary piece. I don't think I agree with him. I think that it's important that he wrote the books in the order that he did, because he called them biographies of George Washington and Jefferson and Adams. They're not really biographies. He does what maybe could be called a biographical treatment. In the case of, say, Jefferson, his great book, American Sphinx, the character of Thomas Jefferson, he looks at a number of key episodes or eras in Jefferson's life and tries to formulate some tentative insights about who Jefferson was, how he was wired, how he tended to respond to things, both personal and public, how much he evolved as a thinker and as a political figure in American life. He had no interest in writing a straightforward biography in which you have to say where they went to school and how many people he courted and how many violins he owned and so on. Those are very important, and then that has been done beautifully for Jefferson. But Joe is more interested in what might be called the humanities approach, to try to tease out the essence of character. And he did the same in Passionate Sage about John Adams, which is my favorite of his books, although only by a little. And then His Excellency is, I think, one of the best things ever written about George Washington. So his approach was to taught for many decades, and he thought through, what is it about John Adams, and how does he stand at this moment in American historiography, and what are the parts of Adams that have not yet been fully explored or understood? And that's where his genius lies, I think. And in addition to that, he has a terrific prose style. So I've been reading this book. It's a really wonderful summing up. I love the chapter on Valley Forge. I liked the chapter on the Declaration of Independence, although I think he was a little puckish about our man Jefferson.
Puckish?
Puckish, just having
Joe puckish.
Yeah, puckish, having fun, taking as the British say, taking the Mickey out of Jefferson. But I think that's part of what makes Joe so charming. So what I wanted to know was how was the revolution sold to the American people? There were about 3 million Americans. He says that 475,000 were Tories or Loyalists. So that would be 1 in 6. Mostly in New York and environs, people that had strong mercantile ties to the British economy. But how was it sold to the American people? This is a time when there weren't really even roads in America. And yet there were, I think he said, 175 newspapers, and the newspapers acted sort of as the Associated Press. One paper would copy what it had seen in another one, and all this allowed the word to spread. And then there were these community associations of ardent revolutionaries who would go house to house and say, where do you stand? And we expect you to be on board with us. And there was a kind of an intimidation factor that was involved. But I had always thought that the revolution was fought by elites, and that the mass of the people weren't quite sure what all the fuss was about. But Joe has shown that the cause, the commitment to the thing, and the belief that there was no turning back had really infiltrated very large portions of the population and an enormous percentage of the actual land mass of the United States, of the colonies. And so that struck me as a very interesting kind of revisionist insight into this. So I found that very interesting. I also was really fascinated by his belief that the revolution didn't so much ignore women and African Americans and Native Americans, although it did, but they were trying to keep on point, that there was a sense in which if you try to accomplish too much too soon, if you widen the brush too much, that you lose the consensus to do this one really important thing, which was to break from Great Britain and form an independent republic. And it's sort of the idea that Jefferson had, one revolution at a time. You can't do it all right away, that some of these things have to be seeded now, and they will then sprout down the line somewhere. And I think that might be a controversial point of view, but it's a very interesting one.
Yeah, he referred to those as prudent revolutionaries, which is fine, and unless you're on the outside of that, then you may have something different to say. Again, the title of his book is The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontents, and I believe it's probably available everywhere. And I also think we may return to this subject at a future date, don't you?
Yes, I'm going to finish reading the book. This will certainly bring up more things to talk about, and he's always great to have on the Jefferson Hour, and he and I are working together because he wants me to be sort of his warm-up guy for the kind of, he's going on a press tour, and he's going to be taking questions all over the East, at least, at book stores and book fairs and so on. And he's asked me to be his sort of his debate partner.
His coach.
Well, not coach. He doesn't need a coach, but his...
Well, you wouldn't use that term, but I would.
His debate partner, let's say. And so that's a real honor for me that he would ask me to do that. You know, here's the thing. There are lots of good historians, and we've talked to some of them, and I've read, most of the historians of that era. But I don't think there's anyone who writes as well as Joe Ellis, and in that I even include David McCullough. I think that Joe has the finest prose style.
Ellis has developed a unique style. It should have a name, but you complimented him during the program on his prose style, and it was well-deserved compliment.
I could hear him blushing, even in Vermont.
Yeah.
So let's go to the show.
Let's go to the show and let listeners hear what
you go to jeffersonhour.com.
to
You can find out about the upcoming cultural tours, including the Steinbeck trip in the Monterey area, and at Tehachapi Pass in California in the summer, Lewis and Clark trips. And also we'll be going to France come November, and late October and November. So people should start to get ready for that.
Yes, and speaking of new books, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention yours, which it's still new, isn't it?
Yes, it's brand new, and it's been out for a few weeks. I'm getting wonderful feedback from friends around the country and total strangers, and so I'm hoping that people will read this book, even if you're not particularly interested in North Dakota, because it's about the future of rural America, and it's about the Great Plains, and it's about sort of what happens in the non-flashpoints, not LA, not Nashville, not New York, not New Orleans. What happens in the non-flashpoints in American life as we move into the middle of the 21st century. And so that's there, and other books too. And so it's all great, and I appreciate it. People can go to jeffersonhour.com to find out more, and please let me know if you have thoughts about my book, The Language of Cottonwood's Essays on the Future of North Dakota. But for the moment, let's talk about The Cause, the American Revolution and its Discontents, 1773 to 1783, by our friend Joseph J. Ellis.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author and creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And welcome to you, Clay. And we are also this week so happy to welcome back Mr. Joe Ellis. And, for once, Joe, I'm going to run through your credits. You tell me if I get this wrong.
Okay.
You taught in the Leadership Studies program at Williams College, the Commonwealth Honors College at the University of Massachusetts, Mount Holyoke College, and the United States Military Academy at West Point. Your bio says you live in Western Massachusetts, although I don't think that's accurate today, and that you're the father of 3 sons and married, that you are the author of 10 books. Listening to Clay, I would suspect the number is much higher than that.
It is. It's 13.
All right. Okay, well, we got that. You were awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Founding Brothers, The Revolutionary Generation. You won the National Book Award for American Sphinx, a biography of Thomas Jefferson, and your in-depth chronicle of the life of our first president, His Excellency George Washington, was a New York Times bestseller. But today, you are here to talk about your latest offering, titled The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontents. And I got the title correct because I've pre-ordered it on Amazon.
Thank you.
And it was released on September 21st, 2021. Publishers Weekly wrote of it, "The colonists didn't describe their war for independence as the American Revolution. You referred to it, sir, as a conveniently ambiguous label that provided a verbal canopy under which a diverse variety of political and regional persuasions could coexist." Is that about right?
Yeah, that's the cause, the term. They begin with the phrase, the common cause. It's shortened to the cause. And so I use it as a way of talking about the diverse constituencies that come together to oppose British tyranny, as they would see it. But that within that group, there's going to be differences of opinion that will certainly become clear over time. I'm uncomfortable selling my own wares, but I'm pleased that you mentioned the book, because the listeners and people that tune into the Jefferson Hour are a select group of people with a genuine interest in American history.
I've been reading the book, The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontents, 1773 to 1783, and very much enjoying it. And I'll tell you what I enjoy most is your prose style. Obviously, the insights and the hard research are there. You've read a lot of documents that are secondary or tertiary in the usual way we look at the American Revolution, and that's allowed you to have some extraordinary insights about that period. But in the end, it's just a pleasure to read you, as always, and you haven't failed to provide that extraordinary prose here. And I know that sounds like flattery, but as you know, Joe, most academicians don't write that well.
A career teaching undergraduates conditioned me to understand the audience I was writing for. I'm not writing to other historians, though I've got a lot of endnotes if you want to look them up. I'm writing for an audience of people who are genuinely interested in American history, who are smart, but who are largely ignorant of American history. And that's the students I taught. And I feel an obligation to, well, let's put it, a lot of historians do research that is time-consuming and energy-consuming, and they can't help but want to share all their research with their readers. It's understandable. But you can't just be reporting on your research like a lab report. You've got to decide what the story is and let that dictate what you retain and what you throw out. And I try to do that so that the story itself guides what is the story, and let that guide the decision about what you include and don't. And if a felicitous phrase comes to you, don't be afraid to use it. And if a really wonderful quotation comes across your desk, make sure you put it in the text so that, like you've heard me say this before, when Abigail is asked whether she would marry John again, she said, I cannot imagine suffering with anyone else. those kind of things speak to students and speak to readers, and I try to put them in.
If we made a diagram of your works, from American Sphinx to His Excellency to Founding Brothers and so on, all 13 of them, and we covered it as sort of a timeline of the Revolutionary era, you've covered an awful lot of ground. And so here's the question Jefferson would ask: what's the hole that you're patching here? What does this book contribute to your overall reading of that extraordinary period that you hadn't been able to get at in some other way?
Effectively, I was 35, 40 years ago when I started writing on the American founding. I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew I started to be interested in the late 18th century, and that produced Founding Brothers, and it produced 3 biographies, one of Jefferson, one of Adams, and one of Washington. But in a sense, now I realize that the book I've written most recently, The Cause, should have been done first. I started at the end and came back to the beginning. And I guess I have 2 assumptions. One is that the American founding is it's the explosion in American history that radiates out from it the values and institutions we continue to live under. And secondly, the founders, the men we capitalize and often mythologize, were imperfect human beings. As a man who's very aware of his own imperfections and have reason to be, we should not attempt to believe that these are superhuman people. On the other hand, as the British philosopher and wit Alfred Lord North Whitehead once said, there were only 2 occasions in Western history that he knew of when the political elite of an emerging nation behaved about as well as anyone could reasonably expect. One was Rome under Caesar Augustus, and the other was the United States under the founding generation. And I agree with that. But I also think that amidst the triumphs, and there are several, we won the war against the dominant military power in the world, and with the first successful war for colonial independence in modern history. We created the first nation-sized republic, which Aristotle, Montesquieu, and all the other experts said was impossible. We secularized the state. There is no religious requirement. That's the first nation to ever do that. And we discovered the principle of federalism, or divided sovereignty. Those are major achievements, and we oughtn't ignore them. There are 2 tragedies and failures. We did not reach a just accommodation with the indigenous people, the Native Americans, and we failed to end slavery or put it on the road to extinction. They are tragedies, and to some extent, one of the questions I keep battling in my mind is, are they Greek tragedies or are they Shakespearean tragedies? That is, were they embedded in the society in a way that no other alternative course of action was possible, even with great leadership? Or were they capable of going in another direction? Was it possible for us to end slavery, for example? And the book that's coming out doesn't answer those questions, but it sets them up, if you will. And I think I got another book in me that's going to address that question.
I think I've heard you say before that what happened with Native Americans, with the indigenous peoples of the continent, has the feel of Greek tragedy, in that it's hard to imagine a scenario in which it didn't play out in some form along the lines that it did. But you have said that the question of African American enslavement is Shakespearean tragedy, in that there were options, there were alternatives that we chose not to follow.
I think that's right. And if you're a Jeffersonian, I mean, Jefferson's life up till 1785, his mature life up to 1785, you couldn't look for anyone in the founding to be more of a leader on the question of ending slavery. And perhaps we should talk more about this in specific detail, but I think that he writes the magic words of American history. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. that the women of Seneca Falls go back to when they look for women's rights, that Lincoln looks to at Gettysburg when he says, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And that Martin Luther King refers to when he steps onto the Lincoln Memorial in August of, 1963, to deliver the I Have a Dream speech. And he says, I've come to collect on a proprietary note written by Thomas Jefferson. So our egalitarian values are rooted in the founding, rooted in the cause, and rooted in Jefferson's language. And most of the great black leaders, and to include Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, and King, all go back to that Jeffersonian principle. And that should not be neglected. But after 1785, Jefferson realizes that slavery is not going to end naturally and almost automatically as he thought it would. And his position becomes less attractive because he really doesn't believe that black people and white people can live together in the same society. And that's creates a problem, to be sure. And from 1785 to his death, he's going to disappoint you if you're looking for someone who's going to stand by the very values he began.
Gentlemen, we need to take a short break from this conversation, but we'll return to it in just a moment, at which time, Mr. Ellis, I'm going to give you an opportunity to defend yourself against a charge made by none other than George Washington.
Oh, my God. Okay.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. This week, the conversation between the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and the noted author, Joseph Ellis. And Joe, when we took our break, I was going to bring up what I called a bit of an accusation by George Washington. He claimed that anyone who attempted to provide an accurate account of the War for Independence would be accused of writing fiction. How do you respond?
He did. I understand, and I used that in the book itself, of course. And he's referring to the fact that so many of the battles in the war could have gone the other way. The escape across the East River in 76 is a miracle, and the way in which events fall together at the end of the war at Yorktown, it's so providential that if you made it up, no one would believe it. And so that's what he's referring to. What I would counter, the American citizenry are for the first time are capable of understanding why the British lost the war and why the Americans won it. And if it were a war between two armies in conventional army fashion, I don't think it would be possible for America to win the war. And that's what Washington was referring to, how this army of rank amateurs could defeat one of the major armies in the world, but also the British Army and Navy together, which is the most formidable military force in the world when put together. See if this sounds familiar to you, that a new world power steps onto the scene for the first time, convinced of its own invincibility and omniscience, and believes that it can dictate to the world what its own agenda is, and immediately steps into a quagmire, into a war which in the end proves unnecessary and unwinnable. And that was the American Revolution from the British side. They called it the American Rebellion. The reason the British could never win the war is because they could win every battle, but they would still lose the war, because the war wasn't just between armies. It was control of the population. They could never subjugate the entire population. And every time they left an area, it was like, as one British admiral said, a ship going through the ocean, and behind it the waves just flowed over where you'd been. The Americans controlled the countryside. And because of that, the British victories in battles were, in the end, irrelevant. Although if they had managed to destroy and annihilate the Continental Army and Washington, I don't know how it would have played out. We can't know the answer to that. When it came up in certain moments during the war, what Washington said was, they'll just find another army and another Washington. So from my point of view in the book, the British cause was always lost. And in the end, it was inevitable that we would win the war. And even if they had decided that they were going to hang it out, they could have stayed there for 100 years and spent billions and billions of dollars, and it would have still ended up the same way. And if that also has some echoes in your mind about Afghanistan right now, I think those echoes are legitimate.
So, Joe, I want to just circle back for a moment. You said there were two tragedies, two failures. One is the failure of the founders and the Enlightenment to liberate the enslaved people of America and to overcome its own pretty deeply embedded race prejudices. And the other was the failure to find a way to deal justly with the indigenous peoples who were being displaced and replaced by Anglo-American settlers. If I'm going to channel my inner Abigail Adams here and say, hey, remember the ladies, isn't that a third failure? Isn't that a pretty serious third failure, that the founding fathers couldn't hear Abigail Adams when she said, remember the ladies, or they couldn't hear Mary Wollstonecraft when she said, how serious are you about the liberation of humankind?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and the women at Seneca Falls in 1848 made just that point, and the first line of their report is, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. I think that the correct, though overly succinct way to put it, is that the American Revolution was a prudent revolution. It was led by men, including Jefferson, who believed that they had a revolutionary agenda, but that agenda had to be implemented gradually, and that evolutions were more enduring than revolutions. In that sense, it's directly opposite to the French Revolution. And in that sense, it's not really a revolution in the same sense that the French or the Russian revolutions were. And that there were four issues that were clear, that were part of the agenda of equality. One was the dismissal, the end of the property qualification to vote. And that happened fairly early in 1820s and 30s. The other was what you mentioned, women's rights, and that took for a much, much longer time. For the women's right to vote doesn't happen until 1920. The third was the successful end of slavery. That happens with the Civil War, but if you take the egalitarian side of that, the civil rights movement of the 60s represents the final, an extension of the liberal promise of 1776 to give the vote to and civil rights to the African-American population. If you believe that justice delayed is justice denied, you're going to find the American Revolution disappointing. On the other hand, I think that from the point of view of the revolutionaries themselves, any attempt to implement the full implications of the revolutionary agenda immediately would have destroyed the revolution completely in the French fashion. And so in some sense, Ellis is arguing that the American Revolution succeeds in a way the French Revolution does not, because it's not really a revolution. It's the commitment to a set of revolutionary principles to be implemented over a long period of time.
This is an argument that I think is central to the first part of your book, and it allows us to look at the exchange between John and Abigail Adams, the Remember the Ladies exchange, in a somewhat better light, because I think you're arguing that Adams and others, including Jefferson, realized that they had to keep their eye on the ball, that this was about independence. This was about detaching ourselves from the British imperial system and establishing a new republic, and that they did not want to dilute that pure work by adding on a whole series of desiderata that people might put forward progressively, and that Adams literally felt that if we strayed and started to make a wish list of things that could now happen, that this might endanger the revolution itself. Isn't that your thesis?
It's true, yeah. And even Abigail, for example, she raises her daughter in a conventional fashion, and she hates Mary Wollstonecraft for whatever the reason. And she's a very liberated woman and an independent woman, no question about it. But she makes no claim for women's right to vote in her own lifetime. She knows that's far off in the future. I think Jefferson, unlike Adams, was more prepared to see this happening more quickly, because he didn't foresee the level of opposition, for example, that would come on the slavery issue. Jefferson is more of a utopian, and he's more of an idealist. Adams is more of a realist, and at times a real curmudgeon on this matter. And that's the reason their dialogue at the end of their lives, as both you and I, Clay, have read that so many times, the correspondence. Listeners to this, if there's one thing that I would recommend that you read, is the correspondence between Adams and Jefferson from 1812 to 1826, because that's the dialogue between these two great men and these two sides of the American Revolution. Each of them has a distinctive voice, and each of them has a part of the right answer.
You know, in your book, you refer to these men that you've been talking about with Clay as, quote, prudent revolutionaries. I found that term very interesting, and you say, whose prudence proved wise yet tragic when it came to slavery, the original sin that still haunts us.
Yeah, they're right on deferring, but they and the word prudent comes from Jefferson. It's, Jefferson's most famous words are, we hold these truths to be self-evident. His most forgotten words come right before that. He said, prudence dictates that governments long established should not be ended for light and transient reasons. And he's talking at that moment, and this is to remind our listeners that, remember that the war starts in the summer of 1775, and Bunker Hill is one of the bloodiest battles in the war. But Americans don't, and Lexington and Concord happened in April of that year, 75. But we do not declare independence until July of 76, over a year later. And it's during that time that Jefferson is saying we have to do everything possible to avoid a war, and everything possible to avoid this movement of independence. We have to give Great Britain their opportunity to recognize that it's making a mistake by militarizing this argument, and by throwing these troops into Boston, and by attempting to double down on their attempt to take away our rights. They really do wait, and they really do continue to hope that the George III and the British ministry will come to its senses. They come to their senses 2 or 3 years later when they realize that they've stepped into a quagmire, and they offer in 78 all the terms that Jefferson and the other founders wanted in 75. But by then it's too late. Too many people have died. Too many women have been raped. Too many towns have been burned to the ground, and they can't go back.
Wasn't it Adams who said that the real revolutionary in this whole thing were the British, because what they were doing was so far out of the realm of decency?
That's right. Adams said that we're the ones who are the conservatives. We're insisting on the rights of British citizens and the rights under British and English law. And you're defying those rights by denying us by taxing us without our consent, and later on imposing duties on us without our consent, and then imposing troops on us in Boston without our consent. And so as long as it remains within a violation of British law, it's still pretty conservative. When you move to the next level, and it's Jefferson that moves us to the next level along with Tom Paine, The next level is natural rights, not just the rights of British citizens, but the rights of all human beings qua human beings. Paine's Common Sense comes out in spring of 76, and that's the reason that Jefferson's introductory paragraph, or the start of the Declaration, is so important. That Jefferson says the rights we're fighting for are not just the rights of Englishmen, they're the rights of human beings. They're natural rights. And those, if once you go to natural rights, you've expanded the political universe and the ideological message. And you've got to include women then, and you've got to include people of color then, and you've got to include Native Americans then, because they're all human beings. The religious leaders of the period, especially what we would now call the evangelicals, they called them the New Lights back then. The people who were Baptists, well, Quakers, Baptists, and Methodists are all on the extreme left at this moment. They are the ones that carry in the churches the message that blacks are equal and must be granted their freedom, that women must be granted freedom. They're the ones at the front edge. They're not interested in the political issues. They're interested in the moral issues at stake. It's interesting because the evangelicals now seem to be on a different side.
Joe, another thing that really interested me in your book, The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontents, is the way you talk about how the cause was disseminated and embraced across the 13 colonies on the Atlantic seaboard and also into the interior. And the old sort of received wisdom was that the revolution was fought by an elite cadre of people like Jefferson and John Adams and George Washington, and that the average American was either somewhat indifferent to all of this or maybe couldn't see what all the fuss was about. But the argument I think I see in your book is that the revolutionary cadre worked hard to make sure that there was a buy-in throughout the country, into the rural zones as well as the cities. And they did this sometimes by way of persuasion and sometimes by way of coercion and intimidation, but that there was a much greater, a broader commitment to the cause than we sometimes have been led to think. Is that a fair reading?
Yes, it is. And the way I think I put it in a book, and I put it now with you, is that historians over the years have tended to divide into two camps on this. One that looked upon the political elite, the Jeffersons, the Adamses, the Dickinsons, the Washingtons, who are enforcing and insisting upon the rebellion and the cause. And then the other group of historians that saw it as a bottom-up kind of formulation, where people on the ground in the local towns and villages were the real force. And the right answer, you can imagine, is both things are true. And that the bottom side of this is especially interesting and important for our listeners, because in 74, 75, they created something called the Continental Association. It was originally designed to implement the non-importation agreements to effectively mean that we would respond to British policy by refusing to purchase their goods and services and exercise economic pressure on Parliament to try to stop doing this. The Continental Association created a series of committees. When I say a series, like thousands of them. Every town, every hamlet, every city, every village had a committee of safety or a committee of security, and that what would happen is you're living anywhere in America and someone would come to your door. It would often be a neighbor. It would often be a woman, and would tell you that here was an oath that you need to sign. And the oath was a commitment to the cause and a commitment to the principle that we would oppose British tyranny. If you didn't sign it, they would come back and say, oh, please reconsider. And if you then didn't reconsider, they published your name in the newspaper as a person who was a Tory. And you were then not allowed to go to church, not allowed to go to dances. If you were a merchant, they wouldn't buy food from you. And if after a while you didn't come around, they'd come by your house and threaten to burn it down. And eventually, they were regarded as a sinner, and the congregation would expel you from the congregation. Now, they wouldn't kill you. It's not like the French Revolution, where you would go to the guillotine. But eventually, there are about 450,000 loyalists in the United States, 450,000 people who don't go along with the revolution. But what this does is politicize the interior and people on the ground, that no one can remain neutral. Key. Most people would have liked to remain neutral. Their lives weren't, they were farmers. They were born, grew up, and died within a 3-day horse ride of the location. But they were forced to commit. And this association, this Continental Association and these committees were the way in which that was enforced. And they had control of the countryside by the time that the war was officially declared. And that's the reason why I'm saying the British could never win the war.
It's time to take another short break. We're talking with Dr. Joseph Ellis, our returning champion. We're looking at his new book, The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontents, 1773 to 1783. I have a question about the title when we return. Stay tuned. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Joe Ellis, the title, The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontents, as I know you know, echoes Sigmund Freud, Civilization and Its Discontents. What's up with that?
It's a way of saying that the American Revolution had a downside as well as an upside, that there were certain things that come out of the revolution that we're extremely proud of and that, in fact, define the future of the liberal tradition in American history for the next 200 years. But on the other hand, we've already mentioned the two biggies, the failure to end slavery and the failure to reach a just accommodation with the Native American population. But the other thing that comes out of that is attitudes towards government itself, that in the beginning, the cause means that the government is us, that we are coming together in this cause to declare our independence and to win our freedom. But by the end of the war, the support for the Army and the support for the government, the Continental Congress and then later the Confederation Congress, has waned, and that unum has given way to pluribus. Any robust expression of federal power at the national level is regarded as a creation of parliament inside America, and that's demonized. And so the argument that we've been having ever since, and we are still having now, is government us or them, begins at the revolution. And both sides of that argument have a legitimate claim. Washington is the main spokesman for the us side. Hamilton joins him in that regard. On the them side, we have our man Jefferson, who believes that government is not necessary to achieve the goals we want because individual citizens will internalize, this is what he means by self-government, the values of the collective and the values of other people. But my reason for the title is to say that the American Revolution produces, in some sense, it's tragic on the two issues already mentioned with blacks and with Native Americans, but it also creates this, at times, cacophonous dialogue about whether we are a people or not, and whether the government represents us collectively or not. And that argument is fraught with tension, and we're still having it right now.
We're discussing the new book, The Cause, with Dr. Joseph Ellis. Joe, when Freud wrote his late masterpiece, Civilization and Its Discontents, he said that everyone is effectively an enemy to civilization because each of us in our natural state has some element of the reptilian, of the Hobbesian, that there's a brute, there's a rapacious, aggressive, self-serving brute in each of us, and that it takes everything that civilization can do to make us internalize self-control or to externalize it by way of social control. So the question I have is America unique or unusual in this dialogue, this distaste for external authority, or is this everywhere the case, and we just have a different sort of rhetoric and ideology for it in the United States?
I think it's closer to unique. It's because of our commitment to what we've come to call democracy. They didn't like the word democracy. Democracy in the late 18th century was an epithet, even for Jefferson, until 1816. But I do think that you're getting at something, and Freud was getting at something that we can see now, that we have a population in which a significant number of Americans refuse to wear masks or refuse to be vaccinated, and that because they see government as hostile. On the one hand, you would like them to oppose government whenever it's doing anything dictatorial, but that in this particular instance, the failure to take the vaccine has implications for everybody else in the collective too. And it means that we're never going to reach herd immunity. And so civilization creates a backlash in America that's stronger than in most other countries, because most other countries don't have the same democratic origins that we do and don't have the kind of individualistic ethic that we do. China, for example, is quite different in this regard. So is France. We're difficult. We're more impulsive. And don't look for us to be particularly consistent as a nation state, which is difficult for a world power to be as inconsistent as we are. And so the discontents are very visible now, and they have their origins in our own revolution.
What do you suppose the founders, let's say Adams and Jefferson, would have said about this paradox, that people refuse to wear masks, they refuse to be vaccinated, they belong to the philosophy, don't tread on me, with respect to government? But if Delta Airlines asks us to wear masks, we do. At Home Depot or Hobby Lobby, we wear masks. If we go into a Starbucks, we wear masks. If we go into a Lowe's hardware store, we wear masks, or Best Buy. So people comply with corporate requirements more readily, in fact, dramatically more readily than they comply with governmental fiats. What's going on there?
I think Jefferson would find that more acceptable than Adams, namely that Jefferson is worried about government imposing its values in a dictatorial and tyrannical way. And therefore, if those values are enforced from the private sector, it's more acceptable, I think, to him. Adams is more of a collectivist. The New Englanders in general are at that time, but that and therefore he would say that the government should impose this and require it in the same way that we're at war. We're at war against a disease, and you need to draft people, and they disagree on that.
Joe, early on in this conversation, you said that you should have written this book, The Cause, first. I want to delve deeper into that. Talk more about that, would you?
Yeah, I recognized that I was writing a history of the American founding backwards, and that at least, if chronology is the last refuge of the feeble-minded, it's usually the first refuge of historians. And so I should have started with the 1770s, with the war itself, then gone forward to the Constitution and to the administration of Washington in the 1790s and Jefferson's election in 1800, and maybe then the Louisiana Purchase. But I didn't do it that way. But the truth is that if I had done it the way I was supposed to chronologically, I wouldn't have known what I know now in writing this chapter.
If you hadn't done all of these other books, the book that you have just written, The Cause, probably would have suffered for it.
Yeah, it wouldn't be the same. It's true. It's true. We keep learning, and we keep digesting. And that the result is the book on the 1770s, which is really the first volume, if it was a multi-volume history of the founding, is very different from what it had been if it was written 20 years ago. I guess that means I've grown. I've learned something, and that's a I'm pleased with that.
In the book, you talk about the improvisational nature of the founding. And, that can just be read and slipped by, but that's a big statement.
Yeah, all these men, and Abigail and a few other women, Mercy Otis Warren, Katie Green, were making it up as they went along. They were living through one of the most consequential, perhaps the most consequential political crisis in American history. Lincoln will save a union that we create, that Washington and the founders create. And when we look back, we're always looking back from the present through the prism of the 20th century and the 19th century, and we don't understand what it was like to be there at that moment and not to know what was going to happen later. And recovering the past on its own terms is the first obligation of a historian. We can only make judgments after we've seen the world through their eyes. It is a foreign country. It speaks its own language with its own accents, and being familiar with that. And once you've done that, you realize that none of them knew what we know. And so and when in Jefferson's language, devote their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the cause, the consequences of that to them was everything. And improvisation isn't meant to make it, to demean it at all. It's an effect to suggest that it was a creative moment where the outcome of their own commitments weren't clear to them as they were making them.
And they did, to put it in simple language, they kind of had to make it up as they went.
They had to. But, I've said this to myself and to my students over the years, and tell me whether you agree. All the big decisions that I've had to make in my life about what kind of calling I have, or job, who I should marry, all of those decisions must be made without enough evidence to make them with absolute certainty.
That's a good observation, and I absolutely agree. In the book, Joe, you talk about the brutality of the American Revolution. You're saying it's probably the most brutal war, excluding the Civil War, and you're talking domestic wars, I'm assuming, but it's hard to, that sort of brutality exists one-on-one. It's not a grand scale.
Yeah, I'm saying that our image of the war, of the American Revolution as a war, is set by the paintings we have by Trumbull and Gilbert Stuart and Copley. There's no photographs. There's nothing we have for like the Civil War. There's no Goya, no artist to give us another view. So the net result is a kind of etiquette, a kind of iconic view, and it's really more brutal than that. And the casualty rate in the American Revolution was higher than any other war in American history save the Civil War. That includes World War II, World War I. And the nature of battle then it needs to be recovered in a way that makes it palpable. I think that the historic, what's the name of the gentleman who's writing a 3-volume history of the war?
Rick Atkinson.
Rick Atkinson, yes, thank you. He's very good, and he does a wonderful job at this. And I'm not in this book looking at every cannonball fired in the same way that he is, but I'm recovering the notion that that battle is barbaric. And you have to be disciplined and stand at attention while the man next to you is disemboweled. It's the reason why militia are very poor soldiers in a conventional battle, because they're not accustomed to being able to stand their ground as the enemy is closing on them with bayonets. They can't fire, they can't reload as fast. They can't retreat together. They just run away. So it's the nature of 18th century battle that in some of the chapters I'm trying to recover, and its brutality, and its and the fact that it wasn't a polite kind of thing. Plus, there's brutality. I mean, if you're a farmer living in New Jersey and the British Army comes through, especially if the British Army's got a lot of loyalists in it, and they're the worst. They're going to be the most difficult people, the most barbaric, no quarter. They're going to come to your house. They're going to take the man out. They're going to rape his women in front of him, and then they're going to hang him, and then they're going to burn your house down. So it's that kind of killing zone that's out there throughout the war that a lot of Americans need to recover.
So, Dr. Ellis, Joe, three of the chapters that I find most intriguing and delightful, in fact, in your book are on the summer of '76, the fact that Washington narrowly escaped losing the whole war right off the top. And that is something that you've written more extensively about in the Summer of Revolution. The chapter on Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, where you show that so much mythology, sort of through rose-colored glasses, distorts our image of this, that you almost feel like a heretic or curmudgeon by pointing out the real truth about that. It's a story that you have addressed, of course, in American Sphinx. And then one of the most, I think, interesting of all the chapters in the book is on Valley Forge, which comes up in several of your books, including, of course, His Excellency. To what extent is this book a kind of a summing up of your work, but plus some new insights and synthesis? You must have thought about this as you went through this process.
That's not wrong. I mean, I don't copy from what I've written before. I'm not reproducing it, but I have written about this stuff. I mean, if you're doing biographies of Washington and Jefferson and Adams, you're forced into then you've read their papers for those years. And so you bring some of those insights. But I think that the term "the cause" has given me a different interpretive angle of vision on the same material. And it's in the case of Valley Forge that this is the moment that the Army really does almost go out of existence. And the members of the Continental Army, the officer class, begin to come together as what they consider the few, the virtuous few, the only people who are standing tall at a moment in time when the rest of the country is retreating from its commitment to the cause. And I mean, Washington wanted 60,000 troops, and he never got more than 10 or 12,000, and they're almost gone out of existence. And so pressing that, and then like discovering a woman like Katie Green, who's the angel of Valley Forge, and featuring her in a profile so that the reader can see that there are women involved in the story as well. So, yeah, I mean, I'm going back, I'm synthesizing what scholars have said, what I've said, and I'm trying to bring a perspective in the 21st century to the questions that are still relevant. And if at times I'm echoing myself, then I'm guilty of that.
I certainly didn't mean to suggest that this is repetitive. I think there's something really important about this. You're looking at stories that we all know to a certain degree, that you know more than most. And now that you've had, literally decades in some cases to think and rethink these things,
right,
and you're putting them into this broader lens of the sort of the selling of the revolution is one way we might talk about it, or the hearts and minds argument that led to the key moments in June and July of 1776. I think that's an extremely valuable way to not just to sum up your work, but to try to rethink some of the things that you've been wrestling with all of this time. For example, the Valley Forge chapter is short, it's succinct, some new voices are in it. It's heartbreaking.
Right.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah,
it's more heartbreaking than the mythology of the famous painting of George Washington kneeling in the snow.
It's totally fictitious, right? And I think it's also the chapter where I came to realize that the heroes that I thought most heroic in the war are the ordinary soldiers that signed up for the duration. And there weren't that many of those people. There's about 5,000 of them. and that they actually won the war. It was resilience, and the ordinary soldier who never got a pension, who was never given the recognition that he deserved, and they were most all he. I'm convinced that they're the people that deserve to be remembered in a way they've been forgotten.
So, that just want to ask one more question along these lines about your chapter on the Declaration. And you remember that, and I've heard you quote this, that Adams, in one of his more snarky moments, said, the history of the Revolution is that Franklin smote the earth with his lightning rod, and Washington sprang forth, and they became the sole heroes of this story. You do a little of that yourself here, I think, on page 84 and 85. Let me quote. Myth trumps truth in all popular polls that matter, so it has become almost obligatory to imagine Jefferson sitting at his portable desk on the second-floor apartment at 7th and Market Streets in mid-June. And now here comes Adams, meditating in a solitary seance as tongues of fire appeared over his head, guiding his quill pen to scratch onto parchment the magic words being dictated to him from above. Come on, Joe.
I'm not trying to... Look, that's the single most important moment in Jefferson's life, and he comes to realize that by putting the Declaration at the top of the things he wants on his tombstone. What I am trying to do is suggest that this is not a supernatural event. In fact, he gives more credit to Jefferson. If Jefferson was being inspired by God, then what credit does he deserve? And he's the one that came up with the words, and he's the one who decided to put them together the way he did. So I'm not trying to demean Jefferson there at all. I'm trying to demean the mythologization of the founders in general and Jefferson in particular here. So don't put me in that category.
I'm putting you in that category.
I'm an Adams guy, but Adams was particularly bitter about it because he thinks he deserved more credit than Jefferson in causing the revolution to happen. He's got a case to make. He thinks this Declaration is overrated, but in the end, it's not overrated because those magic words continue to live.
Here are two more of your sentences from the same argument. But even if truth be treason, using the subjunctive, if truth be treason at some point in time after the mythology has served its purpose, history must prevail. And then on the next page you say, while true, it was not the whole truth, and fed the mythology of a solitary Jefferson communing with the gods. That's quintessential Joe Ellis.
It does. The mythology is there, and I'm trying to say nothing happened on July 4th. They didn't sign it on that day. There are a lot of things that are misconstrued about that, and that the most interesting thing is that the passage that everybody remembers about we hold these truths, when they spent 2 days debating the language of the Declaration, they didn't even comment on that. They just let that pass. They missed it altogether. A big part of the message I've had over the years is we must recover these people as imperfect human beings. And that includes Jefferson, as well as Adams is more visibly imperfect. But that what was it? Emerson said in The Next Generation, they saw God face to face. We can only see him secondhand. No, they didn't see God face to face. They were in the midst of a crisis, and they decided to respond to it with as much wisdom as they could, and Jefferson did that. They're all human beings, though. And in fact, if they were gods, what in heaven's name would we have to learn from?
We're listening to Joseph Ellis try to defend his snarky language from his new book, The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontents. I agree with you, of course, that one of the things that historians must do is to try to pierce through the accumulated mythology and some bad notions that get passed on again and again in the course of American history. Joe Ellis, it's a pleasure as always. I love this book, The Cause, America's Revolution and Its Discontents, 1773 to 1783. Come back, we'll talk further about this book and try to sort out truth v. mythology of the American Revolutionary era.
And at the process, I'll try to keep my dogs, who are barking in the background now, further away from the premises.
Those are your discontents. We'll see you soon.
They're barking for me, not against me.
We love your dogs, Joe. Don't worry about it. Thanks so much for being on this week.
My pleasure.
An extraordinary conversation with one of my favorite historians, Joseph Ellis. We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.